First and foremost, it is enshrined in the North Korean constitution that they must complete the revolution to unify the peninsula under its domination and to rid the peninsula of foreign forces and foreign influence. So that is the lasting legacy of the Korean War. They did not complete its objective.
If we allow North Korea to continue down the path it's on in building the world's most terrifying ballistic missiles, we are looking not just at a threat to the Korean Peninsula or Northeast Asia, that's a global threat.
"1953 brought stalemate to the Korean front. At the negotiating table, peace talks stalled as both Russia and China saw advantages in keeping the conflict alive. Both North and South Korea were largely destroyed, their cities in ruins, their population decimated. If hostilities were to cease, issues like reunification and demilitarization would have to be put off. As we'll see, the struggle for Korea continues to this very day, an endgame that, so far, refuses to reach its conclusion."
Despite desperate efforts by the United Nations to secure a ceasefire order from Beijing, nothing but a flat rejection has been met. Secretary of State Acheson comments on the latest Red reply.
The reply of the Chinese Communists to the United Nations ceasefire proposal is still further evidence of their contemptuous disregard of a worldwide demand for peace.
Facing opposition from within his own party, Harry Truman declined to run again for the presidency in 1952.
"I shall not be a candidate for re-election. I have served my country long and I think efficiently and honestly. I shall not accept a renomination. I do not feel that it is my duty to spend another 4 years in the White House."
On the Republican side, Douglas MacArthur's campaign for the nomination flagged. Instead, it was another war hero who headed the GOP effort to win the White House.
"Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States."
In January, Dwight David Eisenhower succeeded Harry S. Truman as President of the United States. A five-star general who served in the Second World War, Eisenhower had promised to end the conflict on favorable terms for South Korea and the U.S. There were changes in the Kremlin as well. In March, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin died, ushering in a period of uncertainty in Moscow. After an internal struggle, Nikita Khrushchev emerged as the new leader of the Soviet Union. Unlike Stalin, the new regime desired an end to the war. Decades later, decoded top-secret cables between the Soviets and North Koreans revealed that in the weeks after Stalin's death, even Kim himself grudgingly agreed it was time to negotiate, telling his Russian counterparts he now, quote, fully agrees with the proposal of the Soviet government on the Korean question, and that this proposal must be implemented as soon as possible.
What eventually made for the possibility of a ceasefire was Stalin's death. It did not slow down the process that incoming President Eisenhower let it be known that if they couldn't get a ceasefire, they'd go back to toying with nuclear weapons to enforce an end to this war. And General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, had a fair amount of credibility in talking about military questions.
Long-stalled discussions now resumed in earnest. As the war entered what many hoped would be its final phase, both sides saw that any ground taken in the last days of battle would provide an advantage at the negotiating table. The ridges and mountainsides that narrowly separated the two armies now became the scene for some of the most brutal fighting of the entire war.
United Nations forces send a withering curtain of fire into the human waves of Reds assaulting Old Baldy Hill. Dogged UN counterattacks are mounted. Bone-weary troops snatch a few moments from one of the most savage battles of the war for much-needed rations and rest.
Another seemingly insignificant knoll, identified on U.S. military maps simply as Hill 255, became the site of a bloody fight now remembered as the Battle for Pork Chop Hill. Two separate campaigns were waged in the spring and summer of 1953 over this small piece of ground. 243 Americans and an estimated 1,500 Chinese gave their lives in what would be one of the last all-out battles of the war. While Chinese forces ended up with control of the disputed territory, it was largely a meaningless victory. Armistice was just weeks away. The treatment of prisoners of war emerged as a major stumbling block to negotiations and was among the last issues to be resolved. Both sides agreed to abide by the Geneva Convention of 1949, but returning Chinese and North Korean soldiers to their homeland proved controversial. UN forces had captured almost 100,000 communist soldiers over the course of the war. Some of these POWs now claimed that they had been forced to enlist and did not want to return home. At first, China demanded the repatriation of all its soldiers, but eventually relented. Some 22,000 communist soldiers decided to seek asylum in the South. Many South Korean soldiers were denied the same choice.
Something that people don't know is the fact that an estimated 78,000 South Korean military personnel were kept in North Korea and never released by North Korea. A human rights atrocity that continues to this day. The prisoner exchanges were the real sticking point in negotiations, and that's what took almost 2 years to negotiate.
American soldiers were part of the exchange as well.
There's still stories that not all American prisoners were returned. Some went to the Soviet Union, some went to China. We're still trying to account for them. That's one thing about the United States and the United States military. We have an agency for missing in action and prisoners to ensure their return. But most of the Americans, for sure, were returned, but we don't know the fate of all of them. There's likely that they weren't all returned, and some later died in captivity after the war, which is another tragedy.
While the communists signed at Panmunjom, General Clark, in ceremonies at the UN base camp in Munsan, signed 6 copies of the document which would end the bloodshed.
We have stopped the shooting. That means much to the fighting men and their families, and it will allow some of the grievous wounds of Korea to heal. Therefore, I am thankful.
The agreement called for a complete cessation of hostilities until an official peace treaty could be negotiated.
There could not be a political settlement. This is something I think people don't understand. It was the military leaders who really took that initiative to negotiate, and they really drafted the armistice. The Chinese People's Volunteer commander signed it, and Kim Il-Sung signed it, but not as the head of state, not as the president, as the commander-in-chief.
Neither the U.S. nor the South Korean government ratified the agreement.
Syngman Rhee did not sign it. Of course, Syngman Rhee wanted unification. He was opposed to the armistice. In fact, the United States technically didn't sign the armistice. The agreement, the armistice agreement, is between the United Nations forces, the North Korean People's Army, and the Chinese People's Volunteers.
The fact that there was an armistice rather than a peace agreement is terribly important. And it haunts us, of course, to this very day, because the North Korean side has never agreed that there is peace in the Korean Peninsula. It's only a ceasefire. The South Korean side has also taken the standpoint that there is only a provisional territorial settlement. The South Korean Constitution claims all of the Korean Peninsula. The North Koreans do the same.
Almost 1.8 million Americans served in Korea during the war years. They returned to an America that had largely already forgotten about the conflict.
Korean War vets are certainly a different breed. Fighting in Korea was every bit as tough as fighting anywhere else on the planet, in very, very frozen areas much of the time. And the veterans talked about what gruesomely cold times they had to fight in. And of course, they were horrifically outnumbered by the Chinese when the Chinese came into the war. And so they speak of Korea, interestingly, in terms of the kinds of attacks that the Japanese launched in World War II, but in European-style terrain, very cold terrain. So you had almost the worst of both worlds, the worst of the war in the Pacific and the war in Europe.
With the return of most UN troops and the withdrawal of the Chinese army, negotiations began for a formal peace treaty and elections that would unite Korea under a new government. Talks opened in Geneva in 1954, but quickly broke down.
Well, a peace agreement could not have been negotiated because neither the North Korean side nor the South Korean side wished to see this as the enduring settlement for the peninsula. President Syngman Rhee wanted no part of the negotiations. He wasn't terribly quiet about indicating that he thought he was being sold down the river with these. But that did not mean that he had given up his ambitions for unifying the entire country under his rule.
Korea remained divided, this time along what came to be called the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ. The new border ceded land that had been previously held by South Korea to the north. Villages and even individual farms were cut in half. More than 150 miles long and 2.5 miles wide, the DMZ would soon become one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world.
By the end of the war, the Cold War was in full flower. North Korea was on the front line of the Cold War, and so the Soviets and the Chinese had to continue supporting North Korea, as American forces were just on the other side of the border. South Korea was on the front line of the Cold War for the United States. It had invested so much in the war. So neither side was willing to give any ground politically. So both the government in the North and the government in the South were determined to still get control of all of Korea at some point, somehow.
The two Koreas had been shattered by the war. Between 3 and 4 million Koreans died in the conflict, the majority of them civilians. Cities and towns on both sides of the new border lay in ruins.
The war in Korea was a proxy war. You had just massive military forces from the UN side, from the Chinese side, all fighting on a relatively small piece of land. There was a political determination not to allow the war to go beyond the borders of the Korean Peninsula. So therefore, in Korea itself, it was extremely intense.
Both sides set out to rebuild their economies. In the north, Kim Il-Sung reached out to Moscow and Beijing for support, while the south relied on American aid.
The North was richer and more productive before the partition. After the partition, the North bounced back much more rapidly than the South, which was in a morass of corruption and internal infighting and dysfunction. By the late 50s, people who were Korean in Japan and wanted to go back to the peninsula were voting with their feet, and they weren't going to the South. There were almost 100,000 ethnic Koreans in Japan who in the late 1950s and early 1960s went en masse to the north. That's inconceivable now, but actually up until about the mid-1970s, according to CIA assessments at the time, the North Korean economy on a per capita basis was ahead of the South Korean economy.
While he depended on Soviet and Chinese aid to prop up his economy, Kim Il-Sung began to distance himself politically from his communist benefactors.
At the end of the war, then, North Korea needed the Soviets and the East Europeans and the Chinese to rebuild North Korea, but they did not trust them. Kim Il-sung began presenting the war to his own people in newspapers and in radio broadcasts as a heroic victory by the North Korean armed forces led by himself, right? Completely omitting the contribution of the Chinese. At the main war museum in Pyongyang, which I've visited, there's no mention of the Chinese. That takes a lot of chutzpah, we might say.
By the end of the Korean War, it was pretty clear that Kim Il-sung didn't want to be bowing down to the Soviet Union and didn't want to be bowing down to Mao's PRC, no matter how much their support and aid was necessary for his survival. So it was clear that he had his own view, that this was a sort of an independent, Korean-based racial socialism.
Kim's rule was as brutal as any in the communist world. Every aspect of life was controlled by the state. An extensive prison system enslaved anyone deemed a threat to the regime.
Stalin, of course, and his ilk, Lenin, came up with the idea of the Soviet secret police. The Kim family took this and built on it, and they decided that you didn't just threaten people themselves for whatever infractions or crimes you wanted to intimidate them with. You threatened their entire family lineage. So it would be much better to say you are an enemy of the people, and that means that you and your children and your grandchildren are all going to go off to the camp. Got a lot more acquiescence out of that than out of just arresting and punishing individuals. That helps to explain, by the way, why there are so very, very few escapees from North Korea nowadays, because escapees have to think that their family lineage will be doomed if they get out.
At 12:30 Paris time today, January 23, 1973, the agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam was initialed by Dr. Henry Kissinger on behalf of the United States and Special Advisor Lee Duc-To on behalf of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam.
The crowds of Americans and other foreigners lined up at installations around Saigon waiting for buses was the cue.
The withdrawal of American troops from another Asian conflict was interpreted by the North Koreans as a clear signal of U.S. intentions in Asia and an opportunity to revisit the goals of the Korean War.
It told the Vietnamese that this was the end of the line. For most of those who wanted to leave their country, this would be their last chance.
Oh, I think it's incontestable that the North Korean side read the American withdrawal from Vietnam as failure and retreat, not just from Vietnam, but a harbinger of failure and retreat from all of Asia, and as a sort of an invitation for a second bite at the apple. After the U.S., let's call it what it was, after the U.S. defeat and retreat from South Vietnam, North Korea went into hyper overdrive in building up its conventional military force. The North Korean side had concluded that the United States had no will to fight. And they were probing to see what the United States would do if they kept on punching the Uncle Sam in the nose.
2 U.S. infantry divisions stand ready to back up the South Koreans. Close to the DMZ, astride a traditional invasion route to Seoul, is our 2nd Infantry Division, geared for instant action.
On January 23, 1968, the USS Pueblo, a Navy surveillance ship, was attacked in international waters by North Korean gunboats. 1 American died in the assault. 82 more were captured.
The Pueblo incident was a test It was a test of American will. It was aggressive, but it also had a kind of an off-ramp if they had wanted to use it. But the United States didn't do anything about it. And so that, of course, only whetted the appetite for more.
In April 1969, a U.S. surveillance aircraft was shot down by 2 North Korean MiGs some 170 miles off the Korean coast. All 31 American crew members were killed. Again, the American response was limited. It would take almost a decade before the U.S. would take serious steps to counter North Korean provocation.
They did a real test of will against the United States at the demarcation line. They bludgeoned to death 2 American soldiers with hatchets. And that was the only time that the United States really responded. And the United States responded with a full dress rehearsal of what you would have seen in the air if we were going to do a pretty significant military strike on the North, maybe even with nuclear weapons. And it took that for the North Korean side to issue the only apology that they ever issued to the United States for anything.
As for South Korea, Douglas MacArthur himself predicted, quote, "This country has no future. This country will not be restored even after 100 years." But by the 1970s, South Korea's economy was booming. Steel mills, shipbuilding, and other heavy industries paved the way for microchips and flat-screen TVs. By the 1990s, South Korea was on its way to becoming the world's 10th largest economy.
Good evening. When he first took control of North Korea, Harry Truman was President of the United States.
On July 8, 1994, after more than 5 decades in power, Kim Il-Sung died of a heart attack at the age of 82. His son took the reins of power. The collapse of the Soviet Empire and years of mismanagement of the economy had led to an economic reversal for North Korea. Many thought the regime would not survive, but the second Kim ruled for 17 years and lived to hand power to his son, Kim Jung Il-Sung.
Kim Jong-un is really trapped in the legacy of his father and his grandfather, and he really has no way out. They really have a 3-pronged strategy that they have always had. One of political warfare, one of blackmail diplomacy, and one of warfighting. And you can see this in all their actions. They continue to develop their warfighting capabilities up to and including nuclear weapons with the intent to someday fight a war on its terms. But until then, it is conducting political warfare, which is designed to subvert South Korea with the objective to get U.S. forces off the Korean Peninsula. And it uses blackmail diplomacy, which is the use of threats, increased tensions, and provocations to gain political and economic concessions. And you can see this playbook being executed for 7 decades.
U.S. policy after the end of the Cold War was a kind of hapless, stumble-bum, wishful thinking, where U.S. presidents wanted to imagine that the North Korean side would do what they wanted them to. The North Korean side had absolutely no interest in denuclearizing. Its interest was the opposite. Its interest was in becoming a nuclear power that could threaten the United States and try to push the United States out of the Korean Peninsula.
First, I'd negotiate. I would negotiate like crazy, and I'd make sure that we tried to get the best deal possible.
Trump, who had no political experience, came in without any of those learned ideas about foreign policy, and that actually served him pretty well.
And we have a country out there, North Korea, which is sort of wacko, which is not a bunch of dummies, and they are going out and they are developing nuclear weapons.
I won't say that he learned this from dealing with the mob in Atlantic City, but he treated the North Korean side like they were gangsters and like they were tough guy criminals.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
And he threatened little Rocket Man.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury.
There were severe economic sanctions that were imposed upon the North Korean economy as Kim Jong Un's government started escalating in its nuclear and its missile tests. And it looked for a while, as sometimes happens in the Korean Peninsula, as if there might be a war.
That was a big, big problem.
Then, of course, Trump went completely into reverse and started saying that we're in love, we love this guy.
And then we fell in love, okay? No, really. He wrote me beautiful letters, and they're great letters. We fell in love.
I mean, it's very much out of The Godfather. It's just like what you see out of Godfather. President Trump decided that he was going to have a head of state meeting with Kim Jong-un. Did it twice. Trump himself seemed to think that he was going to be the one who would use the art of the deal to sweet talk this guy and get him to agree to denuclearization. Of course, it didn't work. Fortunately, the U.S. side didn't give away too much. They gave away something in that process, but not too much. After that, everything was kind of frozen in a continuing confrontation. And we now know that even a head of state meeting between the two sides is not sufficient to bridge the huge gap between objectives.
For the leaders of North Korea, the war has never ended and continues to serve a political purpose.
While we may call it the forgotten war in the United States, it is very much a live conflict for the North Koreans. It's embedded in every aspect of their daily life, this idea that they are at war. It's strange when you go there because you feel like you're in a war zone. And so that was very helpful for me to understand the power of that ideology, how they see us as Americans, how they see South Korea, and how they engage with the rest of the world. It is from a point of conflict. And that is something that serves the Kim family very well in terms of their hold on power, their justification for how they're spending their money. They want to keep North Korea in a state of tension. They want North Koreans to feel like they have to worry about attack from the outside, and particularly from the United States. Kim Jong-un, in particular, he needs to have tension to justify spending so much money on ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons. So right now what we're seeing him doing is trying to provoke tension, trying to raise tensions, so that while his people are going hungry, he can tell them, but I need to spend it here so I can protect you. So I think the narrative of war, it fits his purposes right now, Kim Jong-un. I personally don't think that he wants to do that forever. It's exhausting to be in a state of war constantly. But for now, it fits his objective.
America and South Korea are once again girding for potential conflict with North Korea, this time with nuclear deterrence explicitly part of the battle plan. In the spring of 2023, U.S. and South Korean forces held their largest joint field exercise in 5 years, including an amphibious assault, practice for a 21st century version of the landing at Incheon, designed to take territory, not defend it.
I think that Americans should learn about the Korean War because it's something that's still with us today. To understand the Pacific, to understand China's antagonism towards us, towards Taiwan, to understand North Korea's antagonism towards us, towards the South Koreans, you have to understand the Korean War. Nothing's changed because of everything left the way it was. The geopolitical climate is exactly the same. Well, I think for right now, it's probably the most important war to understand because it's the sword of Damocles which hangs over our own heads.
Today, there are about 1 million surviving U.S.-Korean War-era veterans, men and women who served at the dawn of the atomic age, during what many Americans still refer to as the Forgotten War. But as we've seen, the conflict might better be called the Unfinished War. Their sacrifice and the decisions made by leaders past and present continue to shape our world. The lessons of the Korean War are not simple, but it is only by critically examining the past that we can hope to improve the choices we make in the future. If you haven't already seen my other unauthorized histories, check out the unauthorized history of the Vietnam War and the unauthorized history of socialism, as well as others in the series, all right here on Fox Nation. And keep an eye out for more unauthorized histories as we continue to look at America's story in new and different ways. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'm Brett Baer.